My next guest is Todd Sears, founder and CEO of Out Leadership, a global business network that strives to make LGBT equality a priority in C-suites, business leadership, so that CEOs in multinational companies understand the positive business impacts of inclusion. Todd, let me just ask you, and great to have you on and talking this long line of, my mind's being stretched out in all different places. I guess the question, I always ask this, can we put this topic out of business sometime because we accomplished everything, it's easy to do it. So I guess my question to you, is it an easy lift or a tough lift to do what you're doing right now in terms of convincing firms that they benefit through inclusion?
Well, I would say 10 years ago when I started Out Leadership, it was a much harder lift than it is now. 10 years ago, it was actually a risk for CEOs and businesses to speak up about LGBT equality. Our summits actually were the first time that had ever happened. And now 10 years later, we have 85 multinational companies, over 700 CEOs that are working with us all over the world. And I think the risk is actually not speaking up now, where 10 years ago, it was a risk to speak up. Now companies look like they're out of step if they're not speaking out in the places where they do business. We've been able to convene them all over the world. Casey is actually one of our great partners in Freedom for All Americans, but not just the United States. In 67 countries around the world, LGBTQ people are still illegal, criminalized, and in a lot of places killed and put in jail. But in all of those places, we do business. So my framework is if I can have our companies, and we do have our companies use the economic platform they have in those countries and in those places, we can make change.
Todd, there were, when we were still flying around, and, I was one of the attendees, I admit I would go to the World Economic Forum in Davos. I would meet, fascinating business leaders. But at least up until a couple of years ago, and I don't know, if you went in and you were going to meet the nations and the world's leading figures in LGBTQ rights, they would meet outside the Congress Pavilion. They would meet at Microsoft's Pavilion with Brad Smith and said, we're doing this here to send a signal to Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum that this ought not to be on the fringe, this ought to be central. I think Facebook tried to do the same thing. Google and other places tried to do the same thing. But my sense is that impact hasn't been made at one of the world's largest convenings of business leaders in the world. So can you either update me and tell me where I'm wrong, or is that on your agenda to try to continue to enlighten, I should say, some of those at the World Economic Forum?
Well, you're almost right. There was one convening that was on the main stage. Out Leadership helped convene it with Microsoft, EY. Beth Brooke actually was one of the main speakers there. Everything else, as you mentioned, has been on the side stages. But I think what's interesting and my approach is actually Out Leadership has convened our own summits. So we have summits in New York, London, Hong Kong, Paris, Sydney. We're launching in South America. Every one of those summits is hosted by a CEO, attended by CEOs and senior business leaders in those regions. And I would argue that makes a whole lot more impact than a Davos. We've been able to get folks to have the conversations at World Economic Forum. But when the CEO of HSBC hosts an LGBTQ business summit in Hong Kong and turns his building into a giant rainbow in the Hong Kong skyline and sends a message, and then, by the way, he's the chair of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the next day he's in Singapore where gay people are still criminalized, and he's able to make the case in those closed-door meetings that it's actually bad for business for Singapore not to be supportive of LGBTQ people. To me, that's a whole lot more important than just getting folks talking at Davos.
That's a great point. And Beth Brooke is a friend. And, Beth, when she was, for our audience, was previously vice chair of EY. And when she was there, she commissioned a set of studies once that looked at gender inclusion on boards of directors. And they were able to show the economic bottom line that those companies across the board that had gender inclusion built into their board of directors and their governance and leadership did better than those that didn't, so that those that were walking the walk of it did it. I'm interested in whether or not there are studies that kind of look at LGBTQ inclusion in the same light in terms of looking at those companies that are, I won't call flat earth, but non-inclusive versus those that are. Is there evidence out there that you folks have been able to share?
Absolutely. So one of the initiatives of Out Leadership is called Quorum. I started almost 8 years ago, and it's the first LGBTQ board leadership program. And we've got kind of 3 key pillars. So research is one of them, and we published the first ever LGBTQ board research called Visibility Counts, the LGBTQ board opportunity, just this last February. But what we've also been able to do is create the demand side of the equation. When I started Quorum, there were only 2 companies in the entire Fortune 500 that include LGBTQ leaders in the definition of board diversity, which has actually resulted in, by our unscientific count, 27 out board members in the entire Fortune 500, which is about 0.4%. So what we've been able to do is not just create the data, as you mentioned, just like Beth, and Beth actually is on Out Leadership's board. We're very lucky to have her, but not just the data, but also the demand. So we've been able to get pension funds, for example, like New York City, New York State, CalPERS, and CalSTRS, the 4 largest in the country, to amend their diversity mandates to be LGBTQ inclusive, which is about $4 trillion of assets that say that LGBTQ leaders matter when companies are being invested in. And then the final thing is that we've been able to work with companies like Goldman Sachs, for example, where at Davos, David Solomon announced that they would no longer take a company public if they didn't have at least 2 diverse board members. And for Goldman, diversity includes LGBTQ leaders. Or the NASDAQ's proposal to the SEC actually quoted our research 7 times, making the case that the NASDAQ should have LGBTQ inclusive board diversity for all 3,000 NASDAQ listed companies. So more and more companies, Egon Zehnder is the first search firm in the world to support this effort. None of the other search firms are focusing on LGBT equality or inclusion at the board level, which is something we're trying to change. So there's a huge momentum and groundswell, I would say, the last 2 years. But the first 5 years, it was sort of like shouting into the wind. No one was focusing on it.
So I know you're succeeding in this, Todd, because I had a conversation the other day with the CEO of PwC North America, Tim Ryan. And PwC is making all sorts of commitments on the inclusion agenda, the purpose agenda, ESG, looking across the board, and so much of it, and changing the parameters for the lifetime health support for those that go through transgender, gender affirming surgeries and related health issues. And sort of expanding that. So you kind of look across the board, the next 5 years of PwC are going to be very, very interesting, because not only inside their company that they're doing this, they're trying, of course, to push purpose and this scaffolding, if you will, and this DNA into their client company. So I know you're succeeding. So let's just sort of take them off, all the good folks off the board. Tell us who's not good. I mean, I sometimes believe in the top 10 good firms and the worst 10. Sometimes that can be very compelling. But as you look at the map of what you're trying to achieve now, where or who, what can you tell me about the places that are not coming along?
Well, actually, since you mentioned MAP, I'll talk about our Out Leadership LGBTQ Business Climate Index. We launched it 3 years ago. Actually, Freedom for All Americans, Movement Advancement Project, the Williams Institute, so many nonprofits have been partners with us on it. And what we sought to do was actually illustrate exactly where these state-by-state challenges still exist. Because marriage equality, as actually Casey was just saying, marriage equality did not solve all of the problems for the LGBTQ community. Not everybody wants to get married, but everybody does want to have fair employment and have an opportunity for housing and not be discriminated against because they have HIV. And all of those things are still a reality for so many millions of LGBTQ Americans all over the country. So we created this index to rank all 50 US states on 20 publicly identifiable data points. And then we built CEO business briefs for them, just like we have for 29 countries outside the US. So the business leaders in those states can actually understand how they can advocate for change, whether it's in Tennessee, which has passed 11 anti-trans bills in the last 12 months, or Florida, or Texas, or Montana, or Wisconsin, you name it. The opportunity for businesses to advocate as a business opportunity and imperative. And you're exactly right. We found that this year, the top 25 states increased and the bottom 25 states decreased. So the polarization that we're seeing as a nation is absolutely playing out as it relates to LGBTQ policies. And as it relates to these companies are in the same way. There are so many companies that are pushing the agenda forward, and equally there are companies that are being a bit stagnant. And the final thing I'll say about it is that we have noticed that we actually have data that shows that from a state perspective and a company perspective, LGBTQ people are voting with their feet. Almost 40% of LGBTQ leaders from our research last year said that they would leave an anti-LGBTQ state for a more friendly state, and they're willing to give up 25% of their compensation to do so. So from an opportunity perspective, these businesses are finally waking up and making that policy part of their business reality.
Well, Todd, I'm also a fan of your tweets and Out Leadership, and you sent out something. A friend of mine, Fabrice Hudard, we both know the immense pool of LGBTQ plus board-ready talent is often untapped because it exists at the periphery of the board ecosystem, including in informal networks. One of Fabrice Hudard's articles on this, he's also done an enormous amount of stuff on this front to help. Well, Todd, it's a real pleasure. I hope you'll come back, give us a status report, talk to us. This is not kind of, I believe in Pride Month, so happy Pride, but actually I think we ought to be talking about this every month. So come back and let, keep us informed on it. Thank you very much, Todd Sears, founder and CEO of Out Leadership. Congrats on all you are accomplishing.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this important work. The visibility matters a great deal. I look forward to more.